talk about this topic forever. I've got like 4 or 5 hours worth of content I could do. I'm going to compress it all into 40 minutes in typical Charlie Wells kind of speed. I'm very happy to answer questions at the end. So let's go. So as all good students should be, the first thing I thought was like, how do I break this question down? Like, how does digital therapy is elevating outcomes, reducing costs, and extending results, right? There's a bit of a mouthful. Well, the first thing I thought, well, who am I to talk about this? I'm not a clin psych. I'm Charlie Wells. I'm just a kind of founding technologist. So I thought I'd do a quick introduction to me and why HelloSelf got started. I'm then going to break it down into 3 parts. We're going to talk about elevated outcomes, like how technology is tackling those, how we're reducing costs, and then how we're extending results. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about the future. So one of the challenges of talking about how digital therapy is being transformed by the future is how much into the future do we look? And everything I'm going to talk about today, even the future, is technically possible at the moment and should be doable within the next 5 to 10 years. I'm not going to kind of dream up like what therapy might look like in 100 years' time. What I really want to show is what is technically possible today, but just not quite scaled and not quite economic yet. Sound exciting? Yes, thanks, Charlie. Right, so first of all, Stina just introduced us as a community of clinical psychologists, and lots of you are clinical psychologists, but I'm not, right? So what am I doing running a company like HelloSelf, an organization like HelloSelf? Well, those that don't know, I was a neurobiologist to start with. I was a virologist, a neurobiologist. I then I tried to be Sir David Attenborough for a while. I then went into kind of healthcare marketing for 5 years before setting up a social media company, which I sold in 2010. All of that is not massively relevant. What became really relevant was in 2011, on the 4th of December. I was running a race dressed as Father Christmas, and I collapsed and had a category 5 brain hemorrhage. I ripped the artery to my left visual cortex, and I fell into a coma. I do a 1 hour after dinner speech, which I can tell you all the medical stuff that happened to me. But for the interest of being interested in the future, not the past, I didn't die, and I learned some extremely important things from the experience. So the left-hand picture is me lying in bed, obviously, just on the day I woke up. And I spent about a month in hospital, another 6 to 10 months learning how to walk and see again. And during that time, I learned 2 important lessons. The first is you only have so much energy in life. Like, well, people have so much energy, and when you're ill, energy is your limited resource. And so I promised I would be a ruthless investor in energy. So I invest my energy, 1/3 of it, in keeping happy and healthy. Like, how do you create a strong foundation in order to build your impact? 1/3 of my energy I put into the relationships that matter to me. And 1/3 of my energy, I try and undent the world. What can I do to be an impact investor with my energy? How can I really affect the world at an enormous scale? And I kind of balance it every day, actually. The psychologists in this will probably find interesting. Through pain management techniques, I kind of had to work out ways of balancing this energy and reflecting on this energy and observing kind of how I felt about my pain and how I felt about my progress. So that's the first thing I learned. There's only so much energy in life, we have to use it ruthlessly. The second thing I learned was the kind of power of 1%. So this kind of philosophy of self-improvement. So the third picture along is me learning to walk again with Sarah and Tina. And they taught me to find something, measure it, and try and improve it a little bit every day, 1% a day. I went from not being able to walk to running 100-kilometer ultramarathons. That's me running into Brighton from London on the far right. I went from not being able to see to 20/20 vision. I actually measured my psychometric scores in 74 dimensions, and I was working on those, improving them. And once I fixed the bits that were broken, I then kept improving them and found out there's so much amazing stuff we can do with this thing inside our heads, right? We are all suboptimal. We are all 1, 2, 3, 5, 20, 50% suboptimal, under par. There is more to ourselves than we've discovered yet. And so I wanted to help everyone kind of optimize a bit. I wanted to help every self better. I was trying to like, how can we let the world know that we are able to design and improve ourselves? Like this concept of, at birth, something is injected into us called self, and we have to spend our life being true to it, was false. Like we can build ourselves, we can design ourselves, we can proactively change ourselves, and we can decide we want to live the kind of lives we want to live. So I got obsessed with this idea of every self better. And that's where HelloSelf's kind of core idea come from. So though I'm not a clinical psychologist, I then met Dr. Amina Taylor, who, if you don't know, she's our chief clinical officer. And we started working together on how her world, which was how do we improve treatment and therapy and access to therapy for mental health patients, And my world is about how do we use sort of psychology and understanding of ourselves to help every self better. We brought those kind of missions together to try and understand how could we unlock the power of psychology for everyone, both proactively and reactively. Proactively we call psychological coaching, reactively we call kind of therapy. So that's a little introduction to me. That's why I'm here talking today. But ultimately, I'm a technologist, right? I'm an inventor. And the great thing about being an inventor is you spend all your time staring into the future and trying to think about, how could you do something better? How can we create something new that's never maybe happened before? How do we keep an eye on the technology? I'm also lucky enough that I get to invest in lots of these technology companies. So I am now a brain tech investor. So I invest in neurotechnologies, brain-computer interfaces, and brain imaging companies. I do some molecules, so molecules that are trying to address Alzheimer's and dementia. I'm really interested in kind of the whole kind of brain system and how we can affect that. And that's allowed me to have quite a good point of view on how these technologies are coming together and how they might start impacting kind of therapy going forward. So that's my creds. I don't have the PhD that you guys have got, but I have hopefully some amateur knowledge. Okay, let's get to the next one. So when we started HelloSelf, we had this huge problem, right? And the problem still exists today, right? We have about 8 billion people in the world, and about 1.8 billion of them every year could benefit from some access to psychological advice, whether that's because of a mental health condition or whether that's because of extreme psychological experience, grief, childbirth, all of these different things that could benefit from advice. Different people have different numbers. We're talking broadly, like if you look at mine, they say it's 1 in 4, some people say 1 in 5, but that gives you an idea of the rough number of people in the world that would need it. And today, about 75 million people get access to a therapist anywhere in the world. And that is a high level estimate. So that assumes that developing nations have similar access to Germany and the UK. The US is an outlier. And obviously, developing nations don't have the same access. And last but not least, at the moment, about 2 million therapists in the world. So about 2 million people delivering these 75 million therapy sessions worldwide. That's not enough, right? If we want to deliver 1.8 billion people through self-improvement, we're going to need a lot more than 2 million people. All of you guys are going to be massively overworked. And the problem's getting worse, right? The world is growing. So by 2070, we're talking about 10 billion people, which means that 2.25 billion people could benefit from psychological advice. Like that means that if we don't improve the ratio, you'll see 94 million people getting treatment every year. And so the therapy space is growing quickly, but it's the gap between the kind of required demand, I guess you could call it, and the ability to provide the service is huge and growing. To give you an idea of that, like I love these big numbers, we would need to train about 60 million clinical psychologists within 30 years, within 50 years in order to be able to solve that solution. So we're talking about 30xing the times of clin psychs in the world. We need to be training 1.2 million people a year if we wanted to treat that 2.25 billion people. We're not going to do it. Like there aren't the systems to train this number of people. There is not the scale. There's not the there's not the interest of the number of people who want to become those therapists. And then if you just look at cost alone, it would cost $2.25 trillion a year just paying people to do these therapy sessions. So it's impractical to do it with humans, and it's completely cost ineffective to do it. We're never going to train enough therapists. We're never going to have enough money. But the problem's not going to go away. And actually, the problem could get worse. So how are we going to solve this conundrum? That's basically the conundrum of how do we make every self better in the world. And people are coming up with solutions all over the place. And these are the kind of today's solutions, right? So we could train more therapists. So we need a lot more PhD courses, et cetera, et cetera. It's a protected title. We don't want everyone to become a clin psych. I'm just letting people in. And so that's one solution we could do. It's a good solution, right? And that would help. We could free up therapists to do more therapy. So there's lots of platforms, including ours, that are looking at how do we help therapists spend more time in treatment and less time in admin. The average therapist spends more than a third of their working time doing note-taking, admin, booking tasks, et cetera, rather than spending it with kind of in clinical hours. If we could shift that a little bit, we could use some of that admin time in order to do productive therapy. How do we make therapy more effective? This is about how do we use less sessions in order to get someone better. Because if obviously someone can get better in 5 sessions, you can get 2 people better in 10 sessions than if it takes 1 person to go through 10 sessions. So we can get through more people with the same number of therapy hours if we make therapy more effective. And there are clinical trials everywhere trying to work out how do we make therapy much more effective. And we can bring technology into that to make huge impact. And then the ones that I've kind of really loved is, relapse is a huge kind of cost. So both kind of emotionally and financially. In NHS sort of IAPS, it's just estimated about 50%, over 50% of people are relapsing within 12 months of leaving the IAPS program. Like that cost of people going in and out of the revolving door uses up a huge lot of clinical time. Whereas actually, if we could mean that people went through therapy once and could find some kind of cure, which means that they didn't have to go through therapy again. They have a maintenance model. They could have a self-plan. We could really prevent relapse and save a huge amount of capacity for first-time treatment. And then last but not least, we could try and do prevention. We could actually stop people getting ill in the first place. But there is so much about society and the systems we live in that cause lots of our issues in this world. We're not going to be able to solve all of those global issues, but we can work out how can we deliver personalized psychological advice to 1.8 billion people using an AI. So I'm not suggesting that we create an AI therapist, and we're going to talk specifically about that. I think that's very difficult to do for a number of different reasons. But we could use AI to help people build psychological knowledge and build their own psychological self-plan. So I think they're all really good solutions. The problem I have in society at the moment is we're all doing the 3 not so good solutions. So the 3 not so good solutions are, we are looking at using cheaper or lower quality therapists. I've got nothing against sort of less qualified therapists. They work hard and they do a great job, but the kind of race to zero of constantly trying to find less and less qualified people to deliver therapy so we can do more and more of it isn't delivering good outcomes. It's not delivering good outcomes that last, and it's not actually saving us money on the short term or the long term. And the misery premium could be high. So I'm a big believer in trying to have more qualified people, more experienced people delivering therapy. 2, we could give everyone a one-size-fits-all service, right? We could push people through kind of digital pipes and say, you look like this, go through this program. We're seeing that being done a lot with apps and digital apps and, even IAPS as a service. The problem is that assumes that everyone's the same, right? And I believe in personalization. We all want to be different. Like, you want to be different from me. We don't want to be the same person. We're not the same person today. Like, I feel that my psychology deserves some kind of level of bespokeness in the advice that I get. And we know that personalization leads to better outcomes. So that's also not a great solution. Well, the third solution, which is the worst for all of you guys, is society could pay the very well-qualified people less. So you could just constantly, slowly cut down the amount that we pay therapists so that we can get kind of more people affording it. It's not going to work. It's a complex thing. It's a lot of training, a lot of responsibility. We need to be paying our therapists more. We need to be attracting brilliant people into the world, and so we need to pay them more, not less. And the sad truth is, we're seeing all these things today. We're seeing organizations trying to drive down pay. We're trying to see people push through pipes, and we're trying to see more and more kind of recruiting of less and less qualified therapists. But there has to be better solutions to that. So let's have a dig into the actual 3 problems that you set me. Problem number 1 was elevating outcomes. So the 3 problems were, we want to try and make outcomes better. We then want to try and work out how do we deliver them more cheaply. And then we want to work out how can we maintain them, make sure they kind of maintain long-term to stop that kind of relapse cycle. And everything I share today isn't all being done by HelloSelf, I should say, but I will explain what we're doing in the space versus what other people are doing in the space. But everything is very possible to do, well, either right now or within the next 6 to 12 months. And some of it we're actively working on with some prototypes. We'll show you some of those. So the first thing about outcomes is we have to be able to measure, right? If we want to elevate outcomes, if we want people to get better faster, we have to have a really clear benchmarkable way to measure across multiple different therapeutic modes and models. And at the moment, we've got great scoring things, core 10s and GADs and all this other stuff, but they're quite rigid. So you have like these fixed questionnaires, and you get people to do them as they go into therapy, and you get people to do them as they go out of therapy, and you get an in and out score, and you say this person has moved from severe to moderate or to subclinical, et cetera, et cetera. It shows effectiveness, but it doesn't give us a kind of real understanding of how someone's experience of self has changed. Now, the good news, I mean, this just, you know, the data on the left is actually some of our data. That's our kind of real data. So we have excellent outcome results on that going throughout. So the first thing we can do is we can look at clinical outcomes, but track them more frequently. So for those who've worked with HelloSelf, we track our clinical outcomes on almost on a weekly level. So we can start seeing shapes of how people get better, like how quickly do they recover, and then where do they have moments where they pause on their recovery journey and then start growing again. And fascinatingly, different conditions have different recovery curves. They have different recovery shapes. There's not a huge amount of knowledge about this in the published space. One of the things we're really interested in sharing and publishing is understanding the shape of recovery in different treatment modes for different conditions. And if we can understand that better, we can make outcomes much better. We can design our therapeutic interventions much better. So we want to move from this rigid self-score to what we call a living self-shape. And Dr. Romina Taylor, call her Romina, my kind of business partner, sounds very grand, mission buddy, speaks about outcomes that matter. And they said if you speak to a member, a customer, client, they very rarely say, my goal is to move from a severe 24 on the GAD scale to a mild 13 score. They will quite frequently say, I want to be able to, I want to be able to hold down this job. I want to be able to start a relationship. I want to be able to do a presentation. I want to be able to leave my house. The goals are very human. They're very real. They're about their life. And so we need to be able to capture those goals, because that's, if we're delivering great therapy, people should be able to achieve their goals. Of course, we have to calculate clinical outcomes, clinical measures. We need to be able to benchmark against other services. We need to be able to understand each of the condition types and how someone's scoring against them. But also other wellness metrics, like how they're feeling. And so rather than this being a kind of very simple two-axis graph, what we're actually creating is imagine a three-dimensional spiky thing with millions of axes or tens of thousands of axes for every dimension of self. And someone's self-shape is shifting and changing. So as their anxiety goes up, some of their other scores might go down. As they're achieving their goals of doing a presentation, like this one I'm giving now, my anxiety scores might go up a little bit. But once I've done that, my joy scores will go up. There's all sorts of ways that this self-shape moves, shifts, and evolves. And understanding how that self-shape differs in different people and how there are interactions between both the conditions, but the goals and wellness scores, allows us to create sort of psychological shapes that exist today. So you can have your present self-shape, and then you can have your desired self-shape, your future self-shape. And that allows us to create a lot more rich plans in order to help people manage their kind of self-experience going forward. Like that sounds like very grand on n dimensions, but we're already looking at that at HelloSelf in smaller numbers of dimensions. So we use 4 or 5 clinical outcome measures. We have a goal-based setting on the platform. We have 3 or 4 wellness measures. And so we can create these kind of self-shapes, these goals of, for our members. And we don't have a kind of linear start and end. It's a cycle. So we create our data in circles. We're trying to understand, like, how do I have a continuous improvement plan rather than like a discharge moment? So outcomes that matter, like just the way we collect data, the way what we measure can radically affect the outcomes that we can create. Let's talk about what we can do today with the technology of delivering the right advice in the same way, and then we'll start looking further into the future. So right now, like there are 3 big problems with getting someone better faster. And if we could solve these, we could have a huge impact. The first thing is, how do you give someone the right advice at the right time? So the right advice at the right time can have a huge impact in someone's improvement curve. The second problem is when they sit in an hour of therapy with you guys, even however engaging and amazing you all are, people don't remember it all. Like they're very emotional conversations. They're quite rich. They're quite reflective. You leave and you go, oh, that was really interesting. But then you're like, oh, I can't remember it all. I've forgotten bits. So how do you remember the advice that you're given in the therapy session? And then last but not least, how do you practice it in your life? I'm sure all of you in the good old days before kind of screens, remember seeing in the waiting room, seeing people filling in their kind of, I don't know, emotion diary or something in the waiting room. People, much like going to the gym, don't do their practice. They don't do their exercises. They come and see their personal trainer, but they don't do their homework in between. But if they do, they get better. And so technology has ability to change all of these in a number of different ways. So right advice at the right time. How do we use triggers, understand people's biomarkers in order to provide advice in the right moments? How do we get people to remember advice? On the HelloSelf platform, we have loads of features. Like we have goal setting live in the call. We have remember this button, so you and the member can kind of create notes live in the call and timestamp them. We have video recording, we have audio recording. We're looking at kind of creating some summaries at the moment, where people can get like transcribed summaries of their sessions. All of this is trying to help you remember the advice that you had during the session. And then last but not least, you need to practice it in your life. How can we encourage people to practice it in their life? And not many people know this, but actually on HelloSelf today, on average, people visit the app 5 times a week. So once for their therapy session, and then 4 times in the week to either record an outcome, to review their practices, to look at their graphs, to take notes on their self-line. So they are proactively participating in their therapy. And every time they go back, they can review what they were doing. They can reflect on what they're meant to be learning, and they get better faster. So the graph on the right actually shows a study we did where we looked at cohort of people all working with the same therapists, right? So there's no difference in the therapist group here. They're all the same therapists. And then we looked at people who they were all engaged in their therapy, so they all went through their therapy sessions. But the only difference between these two groups was how much they interacted with the technology. So in between sessions. So they were obviously coming to the session online, but were they using the features between sessions? Were they using the kind of recording functions? And well, the great news was that those who had a higher engagement with the tools and apps got better faster, and they had better outcomes in the long run. So this is over 16 sessions on the bottom. You can see that people's the number of percentage change on their GAD score over time was significantly different. Like this is like 30 to 40% more effective if people engage in the tools than don't engage in the tools. Obviously, this is a correlation rather than a causation. There are other explanations we need to try and dig into, but it's a really strong signal that if you can give people the tools to participate in their psychology a little bit every day, they'll get better faster. And there's loads of ways you can do that today. Like, how do you remind your members to interact and embed what they learn in your sessions in their life? Very simple use of technology. As we go into the future, that gets a little bit more creepy, right? So it's the problem with tracking outcomes and trying to correlate and things is it's quite boring to do the outcomes questionnaires. You're constantly filling in these kind of 15 questions or 10 questions or 8 questions or 7 questions. And people don't want to do them the whole time. And also you're only getting 1 zip test every week. I mean, I know most psychologists at best are doing before and after, like HelloSelf we're doing every week, but imagine if you could do real-time passive tracking. So people are building a lot of wearables. You can now try and do heart rate monitoring to try and predict your anxiety levels. But a lot of work right now is being done on face movement and voice. So people are very good at predicting your emotion from your face movement and your voice. And now people are trying to look for signal for depression, anxiety, stress, and other mental health issues from the way that you interact and the way you move. Obviously, if you can do that, we can create sort of video diaries that allow us to kind of keep track on your kind of mood changes, and we can see your variation within a day, and we can work out when's the right moments to be interacting with you. Like different people might have different points in the day which are more effective for their treatment. It's very powerful if we can build it and see it. It's also pretty scary, right? If we could do something like that, so could governments or surveillance companies. Like when you're walking through a shop, someone could be scanning your face and they could decide what is your likelihood of having a mental health condition and rank those in different ways. And they could use that information to affect the messaging you get in the shop, right? This is the kind of information we need to be really careful with, but it's being used en masse. It's being looked at by gaming companies, advertising companies, et cetera, et cetera. The technology exists. How do we use it in the world of therapy? And this is a project that we're doing in HelloSelf. So this is the least exciting chart I'm going to show in the whole presentation, but I think it's actually one of the most exciting things we're going to talk about. So the first thing is, like right now, we have the ability to create transcripts. People can record their video sessions. And we now have got the ability to transcribe that session into a summary. And actually, a number of you have been helping with that kind of prototype and testing it. So we can take a conversation transcript from a therapy session. We can reduce that into a session summary. So a really good session summary, which is an articulate explanation of what happened within that session. It's a great asset for me as a member to have, great asset for you as a therapist to have, because it helps you remember what happened. We can then take that session summary and we can actually help you guys create a clinical record. How would you structure that summary into a clinical note? It means that you can get much more consistency in your record taking, which means when you go back and reflect on the records before your next sessions, you've got the information you need and the structure that you need. All of that exists today. All of that can be done on the HelloSelf platform, and there are a number of other platforms offering session summaries and clinical record summaries. What we're trying to do is try and take it a kind of step further. So we're also trying to work out, can we predict risk from that? So clinical risk, but also sort of suicide risk and various other, and people's levels of score on those axes that we discussed. So can we predict their core GAD, PHQ scores from the conversations that are happening in the session? And therefore, can we log those in that clinical record? That gives us a great way to be really excellent clinicians, right? That managing risk is an essential part of what we do. And it's what a lot of tech companies do really dreadfully. And then what we're next trying to understand is, if we've got a clinical record and we've got a risk prediction, can we recognize in that conversation what was a goal? Can we say, okay, from that conversation, you discussed, the fact that you want to do this presentation, like, is the presentation a goal that you want to recognize and capture in some way, so that you can set that as a goal in your session? And we've already started, well, we're already seeing results from being able to recognize goals and then recommend activities based on those goals from the conversation you had with your therapist. So what could happen here is, in theory, from a conversation with your therapist, we could create a session summary, clinical record, some kind of risk predictions and predictions on all of the scores on a number of dimensions. We could recognize the goals that you and your client had, your member had agreed, and also capture the activities that you've recommended, as well as potentially suggest some new activities to that member into their treatment plan. Like, this is like AI goal recognition and activity recommendation from a conversation. And it could allow us to radically change the way that people can consume and apply what they learn in therapy to their lives. Because we can then take those goals, we can take those activities, and we can add them to self-plans and remind them that they need to be doing them. It's kind of it's a very powerful tool that can be done with large language models and generative AI. I'm sure I have questions on that. So that's basically like a little bit on outcomes in the near future. Let's talk about reducing costs. This is everyone's sort of least favorite bit, right? But costs are important, because costs happen in two dimensions, right? They happen as a dimension of money, but they also have it in the dimension of misery. And this is where I insult everyone on the call. Like, at the moment, generally, therapy is a pretty poor experience, right? Imagine this is your wellness axis, and then times on the bottom. People are born relatively well. Let's not debate like the genetic kind of preconditions to mental health conditions, but let's assume that this person was born relatively well. Something happens in their lives. They start declining in their wellness. They then fall out of the green, thriving space. They go through the surviving white area, and then they enter the kind of crisis space at the bottom. And they always intervene too late. Everyone intervenes too late. They probably get told by a sort of loved one that you need some help. They then spend ages trying to investigate it, understand it, talk to their GP, talk to their insurer. It takes them a long time to work out which therapist they want to work with. And then at point 2, they speak to the therapist, and the therapist says, I've got a 10-week waiting list. So then they wait for another 10 weeks. And the whole time they're kind of wallowing in this, in the pink area. Let's assume in this case that the person finds the right therapist, right? Lots of people don't work with their first therapist, but let's assume this one does. And let's assume the therapist is a great therapist. They get better fast. The person gets better. They get back to the thriving zone. And then they go through a horrible experience. They get discharged, right? Like, no one likes the word. No one likes the experience. They then go back to their lives. And obviously this is a non-linear. As they go back to their lives, either their life changes and something bad else happens, or they just start forgetting the things they learned and they slip into old habits. And eventually they can go through this relapse cycle. Not everyone does, but they can. This is how society is structured. This is how the NHS is run. This is how insurers think about mental health. And it's just not good enough, right? People spend too long in the pink and not enough in the green. And so society is paying for volume in this, right? We're paying for volume of sessions. We're not paying for outcome quality. And so if we want to change the finances and the pain misery, as in the kind of misery premium of therapy, we need to do these 4 things. We need to intervene earlier, right? We need to work out how do people seek help before they're ill. So that's real prevention. We need to work out how to do faster matching. So no one gets better on a waiting list, right? Let's get people into treatment as fast as we can. How do we make therapy more effective? We just talked about that a little bit. How do we help people remember what happens in therapy? How do we help them apply it to their lives? How do we help them get better faster? And then the 4th most important thing on this whole journey is, once people are well, how do we keep them well? And not all of us can afford to have a therapist all the time. And I actually believe, I'm sure lots of you too, you shouldn't have a therapist forever. Like, you don't want to create dependency on therapists. We want to be able to give people the tools that mean that they can manage their self-improvement going forward. That's the kind of philosophy of clinical psychology, and it's the philosophy of our technology that we're trying to build. Like once you've been through treatment, you have a toolbox, you have a self plan, you have all of these amazing activities. How do we help people adapt them and learn from them and go on a self-improvement path? And on that green pathway, people live a lot more of their lives in the thriving and are much less in the struggling. And the good news is it saves loads of money, right? Because you can pull down the service cost up front. Like there's so much cost wasted in the system of people going to GPs and insurers and being signed off work, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of cost to society in slow and poor service. You can reduce waiting lists and simplify referral channels. How do you get connected care between the NHS, private clinicians, private psychiatrists? How do you make sure all of that's well connected so that that we are very efficient in the way that we offer our advice? How do we make sure that treatment is more effective? That means using less sessions. If they can use less sessions, it costs less money. And then last but not least, how do we prevent relapse, right? If we can prevent relapse, we can take all of those sessions that we are presently using, all that kind of advice you guys are giving in relapse prevention, and we can move it to kind of treating the long waiting list of people waiting. And I'm not talking about reducing 40% of costs and then going, yay, you know, bank it all to profit. Like 40% of cost reduction means you can either charge 40% less, but more importantly, we can serve 40% more people with the same money. We have very limited budgets in our public sector systems for mental health. We need to find ways of delivering better outcomes for that. And this is the bit where I should hear a bit of a hooray if you guys all had your mics on. The really big thing is we don't want to pay experts less to do this. Like there's no point in saving money by reducing quality. It doesn't work. We actually need to pay therapists more, and we need to start paying them more, but for outcomes. Like if we could pay therapists to get someone well fast and keep them well for a long time, like they could innovate and create extraordinary outcomes. But we need to kind of change that paying model. At the moment, this kind of idea of paying for sessions is kind of slowly driving everyone to zero. So let's talk about money. Let's talk about extending the results, because that's where the excitement gets in. So imagine if you could do this. You could take that curve, you could turn around and say, well, rather than having to go through treatment, imagine if you could have intervened so early that someone didn't have to go through treatment. Now, how could we do that? And we start looking at different solutions. So right now on the platform, it used to be that therapists signed up and kind of worked on HelloSelf to take HelloSelf work. Over the last 3 months, HelloSelf's become more of a platform allowing therapists to come on and connect with referrers. They can connect with GPs and psychiatrists and the NHS and insurers, and they can send work to each other through a connected care model. And that connected care model means that you get more effective treatment earlier in the practice, which means people can get through their therapy faster. So it's a great way of extending outcomes. But you can also maintain that care team, that kind of connected care model post-treatment, so that you don't have to be talking to your therapist or your GP, et cetera. The systems, the AI can give you a kind of a care plan to maintain your wellness, but you have this kind of support system on which to call upon, which you can call in early. Very cheap to intervene early. It's very expensive to intervene late. So we've also started looking a lot at like member treatment experiences. So like we're trying to work out how do we move from a very traditional synchronized model where you sit in a room and you talk to someone, and we've now moved that online to where you sit online and you talk to someone. And we're starting to see more and more therapists use asynchronous methods of maintaining wellness post-treatment. So rather than going from 1 hour sessions, people move from 1 hour sessions to maybe a half-hour session, to maybe a quarterly session, to then maybe having quick catch-ups every 6 months. Like you can create these different engagement models that keep people well longer using tools such as the video call and messaging and the self-plan. And then the bit that we're working on right now, which I'm super excited about, is we can actually start enabling an AI to help create those self-plans. So to give you an idea of how this kind of work, like imagine someone is relatively well and they come into the therapy session, and we do this with our employers, right? We have these days which people can book time with clinicians, and they come and they spend 25 minutes with a clinical psychologist, and they basically want to talk about like how they're feeling and basically say, what can I do about this? They want some clinical advice. About 1 in 10 of those people who come for proactive psychological coaching actually require full-blown treatment. So we kind of refer those into clinical care, and they go into clin-psych, and they go through treatment plans. But for the other 9, they go through a kind of coaching model, a kind of psychological coaching model. we could build that AI life coach with technology. You could have the conversation with the technology. This exists today. We've already built one, conversational AI, using a large language model. We've tuned to a psychological language base. It's all hosted on a HelloSelf ecosystem, so it's kind of safe and non-leaking. We've got risk management structures in there. We've got the ability to understand how to have a kind of structured therapeutic conversation, a coaching conversation. And you can go through that, and it can identify your goals with you, and it can help identify some activities you might want to do. And it's also very good at identifying whether you should be talking to a therapist or not. So it's effectively doing AI goal setting, AI activity setting, and AI triage to try and work out, when you should go and speak to a therapist. This is exciting stuff because we can use it for prevention, right? There's the 100 million people that don't have access to the treatment in our core market can suddenly have access to some advice to prevent them needing to see a therapist in the first place. And we're looking at this self-shape as an idea to explore this. So all this is in prototyping. It's all being developed over the next 6 to 12 months, and you'll all be involved in testing it, trialing it, and seeing how it works with your treatment. So this is the way we're kind of looking at the future. So HelloSelf or any other clinical platform are using more and more AI products to triage. Like there's been announcements this week about the NHS using AI triage in sort of cancer recognition, etc. So more and more recognizing conditions will be done through AI. From that AI triage, we can send it up to a match, and we already algorithmically and use technology and AI to try and work out who should work with which therapist, and we're trying to optimize that on who will give the best outcome. Right? We then go into treatment, and we want the treatment to always be led by therapists. You guys are brilliant, right? You guys are the experts, and you are an awesome personalization engine. You work with people, and you work out what's the right thing to do. But what we want to do is help you identify the goals of the member. We want to help you set the right activities. We want to help you set the right practices. And we want then to ensure that people go off and practice those, and that we want to make sure we're measuring all that stuff. And we almost see this as like your assistant, right? It's this kind of life coach that you kind of, as a therapist, you say, hey, can you make sure my client does all of this stuff between sessions? We've seen this model work all over. It works in obesity management. It works in personal training. It works in all sorts of space where you have a human expert giving advice on a time structure. And then you have a kind of AI coach who supports that and takes that information and helps people embed it in their lives. We think this could have a transformative effect to therapy in the really near term. I'm talking like within 6 to 12 months, this could be a radical change in the way people experience therapy. There's also an opportunity here in the middle. If people don't need to see a therapist, they could go straight from an AI triage, and then they could get a very, psychologically, it wouldn't be very deep, like it wouldn't be very good for kind of treating a serious condition. But if they would just experience a little bit of stress, for example, we could give them goals, activities, practice, and measure through the AI. So the AI could actually do that prevention work up front. But obviously, first of all, we need to make sure it kind of works as a companion. So that's the kind of almost now future. In the last few minutes, I want to use like the future, out there future. And this is where the world gets scary and exciting. And so if I ask one thing of you all today, is obviously, hopefully it's exciting to see what kind of stuff's going on at HelloSelf, but we are 5 to 10 years away from a radically different world. And I'd love more psychologists to be part of the conversation. Because I think psychology is going to be the core of most of our economy and society in the next 10 to 15 years. And unless psychologists are involved in designing it and participating in it, it's going to be invented by the technologists and a bit by the neurobiologists. But ironically, I think the psychologist is the most important ingredient. Let me tell you 3 terrifying stories that could be used for extraordinary impact, but it could be used for very coercive elements. So you probably all saw on the BBC last week. So all of this is possible today. So everything I tell you now is possible today. So the left-hand picture, you probably saw on the BBC News. There's been a breakthrough using brain-computer interfaces. So this is implants in the brain, which is scanning people's neurological outputs, and it's helping to translate language, so from thought to language. And so this lady had a stroke, so she can now think thoughts, and her avatar, which is on the screen, says the thoughts that she thinks. So we are translating thought into language. We can read people's minds. It's possible, but it does involve cutting into someone's skull, which is not very easy to do. So, and it's not brilliant today. Like, it's quite good, but it's not brilliant. It can get a lot better, much, much faster. the top picture is a very boring one. It's a Nature Neuroscience paper. So this came out in May this year. It's a fascinating paper. It's one that kind of scares and excites me in equal measure. So this was someone trying to do the same thing. Can we reconstruct continuous language, but from non-invasive brain recordings? So they looked at EEG scans and fMRI scans, and they didn't actually have that high resolution imagery. And they actually took a large language model, and they took these brain images, and they basically set the AI and said, can you decode this language? Can you work out what these people were saying? And terrifyingly, it did. It's not brilliant, but it did. So you put this helmet on, EEG scanner, and you think something, and the machine can write it down. And the most terrifying line of this is, with training, people can block the thought. So it just writes down everything you're thinking, and with training, you can hide your thoughts from the device. But it is that good. It's that powerful at being able to read your mind. So now you don't need to cut open your head to read your minds. You just have to wear a strange hat. And we can literally read people's thoughts. The third picture on the right-hand side is a patent that came from Apple. So this is the new Apple AirPod. It's obviously not a real piece of technology yet, but it's a patent that they've filed for, which has an EEG scanner in it. So it's basically doing a brain scan from inside your ears, in both ears. So whereas in the first two models, one, you have to have surgery, two, you have to wear a hat and you can block it if you want. This you put on your ears, and when you listen to music, it can scan your brain for your thoughts. And the use case for this is, wouldn't this be amazing for mindfulness meditation? You could listen to your recording, you could track your brain activity, you could see your brain activity, and that could help you calm your mind. Could be very useful for neural feedback training, right? All sorts of things. It's also terrifying because advertisers, when they play you an ad on the radio, could read what you think. They could read your thoughts. They could understand what you think in response to your ad. Advertising will pay a fortune for this. Your privacy of your thought is being given away. It's going to be sold. It's going to be commoditized, like all of your behavior data has been done recently. This is a creepy, creepy world, right? Because it's very few steps from that to being able to no longer have a private thought. Like, we'll know how to have a private self. We'll have a networked self. And I also know some organizations that are working on how can we connect minds? So how do we connect two people's thoughts and allow them to think to each other? And then all of these private thoughts are now networks, right? We can share them. We can talk to each other in different ways. And I've invested in a company called CoMind, which is doing some fantastic work in kind of for brain recovery and neurodamage work. But what they're effectively doing is a read-write brain-computer interface. So not only can they scan your brain and see which neurons are firing when you see an image, they can then take the fMRI lasers and cross them in different ways to create different energy in different parts of your brain, which re-triggers your neurons. So you can actually see the image you just saw again. Like, it's literally creating the matrix in your mind. Like, it can read what you're thinking. It can then recreate that with a writing back to your memory device. What does this mean? It means that that within a very short period of time, 5 to 10 years, we will be able to digitally design who we are. We'll be able to download stuff that affects our psychology, our emotions, our personality, how quickly we learn, how our brain works, how our brain functions, how we interact with each other. Our thoughts are highly likely to be less private. And the concepts of self as an individual will be maybe more networked. These are radical changes for the human species and for the societies and the economies that we've built today. The biggest questions of our time are, who am I? Right? Literally, it's fascinated religions for centuries. Like, that is going to hit us very hard when we start understanding, like, who am I in this world of being able to digitally design yourself? Who is deciding who I am? Is the other interesting question. Do I decide who I am? Does society around me decide who I am? Does the government decide who I am? Does the free Facebook app platform for your mind decide who you are? Like, who is going to be allowed to make these choices in the session? It's going to require radical rethinking about how we use data, and it's going to completely change the economies. Like, if you can plug in and experience being anyone, like, why are you going to do anything else in the world? Like, that's how you're going to spend your money. You're not going to spend it on t-shirts and shoes and cars. You'll spend it on self-redesign. And it's going to change the way that we understand each other, because all of a sudden we'll be able to exchange thoughts in ways we couldn't before. It could be a very exciting, positive world, but it could also be a rather terrifying space. But the technology is coming. And if it and it is, it is possible today, it's going to come to be mainstream. And unless psychologists get really involved in the debate about the ethics of this, we're not going to have a new regulatory framework in place in time, and the data will get out there. There's a great book called The Battle for the Brain. I highly recommend reading it. I'll add it to a reading list afterwards. But it kind of outlays some of the technology that's being used in this space, and how we could start thinking legally about structures for this. And one of the big points she makes is we need better lawyers thinking about this, but we also need psychologists to be really involved. You guys have spent a century and a little bit more trying to work out what are the rules of psychology, what are the ethics within it, and we desperately need that thinking for society going forward. So, okay, that's the end of my talk. We'll do questions, but what can you do to help? If you're really interested in the HelloSelf mission, you are one of these 3 people, right? You could be a partner, you could be the NHS, you could be an insurer, you could be a medical professional. Like, we want to work with you. We want to work with more people. We want to change the world, right? We're trying to treat and give psychological advice to billions of people. We desperately want them to work with more partners. So please get in touch with the team. Therapists, like if you're an amazing therapist, join our community. Like you don't have to, there's no kind of commitment by signing up. You can sign up and you can receive and send referrals from your peers. You can just try out the tools and have a play with them. Or actually we have work offers. We have like a ability to take a variety of work from all of our partners. So you can help out with NHS, you can help out with insurance work if you're looking for some work. But you could just be a super interested person, right? Like, oh my goodness, this thing about the future of the world is terrifying. Well, we need more people talking about how brain technology is going to change everything. So like, reach out to me, get in touch. I'll give reading lists. Get involved in Neurotech X, get involved in braintech.io, like share your thoughts, write to your parliamentarian, use your voice. Like, we need to share our hopes of what the future and how this can be a positive future, but we also need to share our fears. Don't be obsessed with the fears. There are huge opportunities as well. It's just about how do we use that technology and how do we regulate it in the right way.